Okay, so I'm going to glue this in stages, starting with the forwardmost ring. I'm just mixing up a little 5-minute epoxy here. What I want to do is first get the forward ring on and allow it to set up enough that I can manipulate it without breaking the epoxy bond. And then I'll set the space for the next ring. And then after that, after it's hardened, we'll actually mount the tube into the body tube. And then the third ring will go on permanently after we get the fins in. Alright, so I've got my second ring here just as a balancing point, so that when I'm doing this it can dry horizontally. Okay, now I'm going to slide this forward ring almost up to the top of the motor mount tube. And I've got it down this low simply because I want it to push the epoxy up ahead of it when I slide it into position, and that will automatically form a fillet on the forward edge. And I'll just have to put one on the back. Okay. So now I'm just going to slide this forward. Too far, that's alright. I'm going to leave myself about 1/2 centimeter here at the forward end. Okay, and now I'm going to very quickly add some to the back side of the ring. So I really don't need to smooth that out. It's not going to be seen by anybody, nor is it aerodynamic. Alright, so now I'm just going to let that sit and cure. Make sure it's on straight. And we'll come back when that has set up. We'll mount it into the body tube at least temporarily, and we'll put the second ring on. Okay, so I want this centering ring to be right at the edge. There. And I will go ahead and mark that. And then when everything is in place, okay, then we'll have that one there, and this centering ring will be right about there, and then the base of the engine retainer will go on like that. And so the engine retainer will stick out about 1 centimeter from the base of the rocket, which will give good access without scraping your knuckles off. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and now epoxy this one into place, and then check the fit again once that is cured. The second centering ring is cured enough to remain in place, and so now we're going to make up some more epoxy here and glue that in. Okay, I'm going to stick the epoxy in as far as I can here past the fin slots. then the centering rings, especially the forward one, will push that forward and create a fillet in front of it. The middle centering ring will be able to do at least some gluing from the back side, but it won't have a whole lot on the front. That's okay. Between the fins and the motor mount and body tube, we're going to have lots and lots and lots of good contact here. Okay, so I'll go ahead and slide this in. And this last centering ring here is not glued in place. I just got it there for a spacer to hold everything where it should be. Just like that. Move that back again. But I will use them to make sure that I'm in the right spaces on all of this. So tuck them back. There we go. Any place else I might have got some here. The epoxy has been hardening for a while now, and so the next step will be to tack on the fins. Now, something I've done here is done some filing, and what I did was first square off this corner here. It had been rounded, and then I took off the very tip of the corner right here. And the reason for this is because there's a fillet of epoxy that's now at the base of this, and in order to get the fin to go in and stay up against the centering ring like we want, we have to give it a little bit of clearance to clear that fillet. So what I'm going to do now is take some gel type cyanoacrylate glue, and I'm going to use this to tack the fins on. This isn't actually going to be the main strength of the fin, but this will allow me to get them in straight, and then after the glue is dried on all of them, we can go in and apply epoxy to strengthen the joints. Okay, and right now I'm not worrying about getting glue on the forward part of that root edge there, just the part that's going to be in contact with the motor mount. Okay, so you can just see the edge of the fin there, and pretty much you just got to eyeball this and hold it in place here, which I'm sure you guys don't want to watch. The super glue on my fins has now hardened, and now I'm going to apply epoxy to the insides here, and this will be hard to see at this angle, but what we're going to do is make a fillet of epoxy here on both the edge that attaches to the motor mount and also on the inside edge of where it passes through the body tube here. Okay, so you can just see that there. And if any runs down, it'll just reinforce the centering ring there. And then as soon as the fin fillets are done, I'm going to put the aft centering ring on and hopefully get this all in one batch of epoxy. My internal fillets are finished, and I've inserted the aft centering ring here. The next two steps are going to be to epoxy in a fillet around that centering ring to hold it well in place, and at the same time I will put on the motor retainer, and then following that I will put on the external fillets on the fins. This may be a little out of focus, but what I've done now is taken some 15-minute epoxy and placed that all around the exposed side of my centering ring here, and so that's binding it to the body tube and to the motor mount. And then I've also got a layer of epoxy around the motor mount, and that's going to adhere to my motor retainer here, which I'm just going to slide on now. Okay, and that's actually a little bit loose there. I'm going to add a little bit more epoxy there, just to fill in any gaps. But I always want to make sure and add the epoxy to the tube so that any excess gets squeezed forward and not back up into the retainer where it could interfere with the motor. Let's scrape this in there. There we go. And if you do happen to get any epoxy down into the motor tube or someplace else you don't want, just wipe it out quickly with some rubbing alcohol. There we go. So I'm going to let this sit and cure for about half an hour or so before I come back, and then we'll start working on the external fin fillets. So now we're ready to apply the external fillets here, and these are mainly for aerodynamic and aesthetic reasons. The main strength of these comes from the internal fillets. And I've masking taped this off. And you have to be kind of patient with these because you don't want the epoxy to run. So what we're going to do is the fillets on the same side of the rocket at the same time. And I am using 5-minute epoxy for this. So we have to be fairly quick, but it has the advantage of I don't have to worry about it running for too long. There are some really good videos on YouTube about specifically using epoxy fillets on rockets, so if you want a more detailed look at this, I would look up some of those. Okay, and the width of the fillet here is mostly up to personal taste. Some people like to have really wide fillets that blend the fins into the body tube really well. I prefer smaller fillets because they have less weight, and it's a bit of a trade-off. So what do you gain in aerodynamics versus what do you lose in the additional weight of the rocket? And what I'm going to do here then is I'm kind of giving it some preliminary shape just with my applicator. And some people use clay modeling tools to actually put a more rounded shape in this. What I'm going to do is actually just use my gloved finger, and I've wetted it with some rubbing alcohol here. And so now I can just shape this thusly. It's a good idea to have some tissues or paper towels here to clean off the excess from your finger. Okay, and then I'm going to let this sit for about 3 minutes so that I'm still just within the working time of the epoxy, and I will remove the tape at that point. And depending on the epoxy you use, you may need to re-smooth these. It's looking pretty good to me. I think there's enough fluidity left in it that it will smooth itself out here as it continues to cure. If you need to wipe up any epoxy that got somewhere it shouldn't be, again, just use a tissue with some rubbing alcohol on it and just gently dab where it was. Okay, so like right here, it looks like I got a little bit under the tape. Same here. Okay, most of the rest of that looks pretty good, so I'm just going to let it sit here on my box for a bit and allow those to finish curing. And it doesn't have to go to a completely hard cure, but I'm going to let those go for at least 20 minutes here. If you're using a longer set epoxy, use a longer time before you peel the tape. Basically, you want to go about halfway into the setting time. So with 5-minute epoxy, about 2 to 3 minutes. If you're going to use 15 or 30-minute epoxy or epoxy putties, they tend to take longer. I just noticed as I was finishing up the fins that I had forgotten to attach the shock cord to the motor mount. And that's a bit of a nuisance, but not an irretrievable one. And what I've got here is a piece of Kevlar cord. And I put a little super glue here on the end, and then I folded it up here and put some super glue down at the fold. And I'm just going to hit this with some isopropanol here to speed it up. And my intention now is to run this down the length of the body tube, hook this around the eye bolt that's in the body tube attached to the motor mount, and then wiggle it around to push it through. And then once I can get the end back through again, I can attach the heavier shock cord to it and hopefully save the day. Now this technique is based on one that Tim Van Milligan over at Apogee Rockets developed, and I'll include his original video down in the description here. He does it a little bit differently than I'm trying now, but it's essentially the same principle, and is also a good technique to use if you happen to break a shock cord. Well, I couldn't get Tim's method to work quite right, probably in part because the length between the eye bolt and the end of the body tube is right where my glasses make their transition. So instead what I've done is I've drilled a small hole here, and this is right in line with the eye bolt. So the loop of the eye bolt is actually right behind this hole. And now I'm going to thread this in, and I may still have to stiffen it. There's a little bit of fibers going through there. Let's see if we can catch this here. And the idea now is I'll take this small string, and eventually I'll be able to catch it out the end, and then I can take a hook on a dowel or some threaded rod and pull this all the way up, and then attach the main shock cord to that. I'm going to use some heavier Kevlar for the actual shock cord here. The best way to actually do this is to avoid doing it and learn from my mistake here. Okay, so I've pulled the Kevlar out through the front here of my body tube, and now I need to catch the other end so that I've got both sides of the loop. And what I've done here is just taken a piece of threaded rod. It's just something handy that was long enough. And I've just taped a sewing pin that's been bent into a hook here, and this will allow me to get in behind the eye bolt and pull the rest of the shock cord through, or the Kevlar cord here. So we'll see if this works. The problem I ran into is there's not a lot of clearance between the body tube and the eye bolt on that side. There we go. So I've got that hooked. I just want to make sure I don't let pull through the other end again. So I'm hanging on to the piece that's already come through. Okay, and there's the loop of shock cord. Okay, so it's these two, which means I can cut this here. Okay, yep, that is the right one. So I'll just pull out my stock of cord there. All right, and then now what I'm going to do is simply tape up the heavier shock cord to this, pull it through the eye bolt, and then bring it up here. 300 pounds is probably more force than this thing's going to see. And if we get a really long shock cord, that'll help as well. So I'm just going to put that there. Alright, now I'll just reinforce it here. Okay, so now I've got my lead. Oh, okay, that shows me that's not on there tight enough. Okay. Whoa, almost lost the end. Almost lost the other end of the string there. Okay, we're going to try this again. I'm just trying to get around it here and just giving some tension. Okay, there it got past the first tape. Oh, there we go. Success. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is tie a loop here. Now for the moment, I'm just going to put a little dab of super glue on this. Just to make sure it doesn't come undone while we're doing other stuff here. And then I'm actually going to put some epoxy over this. Because once this is in, it's going to be really hard to do anything with it. Okay, so normally with Kevlar line you want at least 3 times the body or the rocket length, and I'm going to go for even longer than that, just because this is 300-pound test is probably more than enough here, but better safe than sorry. The finished length of the rocket is going to be about 90 centimeters, so we'll call it a meter just for simplicity's sake. And so I'm going to measure out a meter in addition to whatever's in here already. So just from the edge that I've got. Blade's getting dull there. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and treat this with a little bit of super glue to keep it from fraying. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is I'll pass this through my loop. I have lots and lots of shot cord there. Okay, and now before I cinch everything down, I'm going to go ahead and make up just a little bit of epoxy and cover this knot with it so that it's not going to come undone. And then once this is cinched down, we can go ahead and continue with the build. Alright, so now the shot cord has been mounted, and you can kind of see the yellow through the fiberglass there. And I've also put just a little drop of epoxy in my access hole there, and that should take care of it. Although as I think about it more, if you had to do this, you could probably leave that open and use it as a pressure relief vent anyway. So one other little last minute bit of construction before painting is to drill holes for the rail buttons. And I've got one up here on the forward end. The nose cone shoulder will come down to about here, and so this is just below that. And I've left enough room there for a T-nut or just a regular nut to go behind the body tube and mate up with the screw. And then at the aft end, I've got my other hole down here halfway between the aft centering ring and the edge of the body tube. And I prefer to go ahead and paint this before actually putting on the rail buttons, but I like to have the holes in place so the paint will hide any little scratches and such that are in the fiberglass. One last thing before we leave this model is that I did not airfoil the fins on these. They're pretty thin to begin with. What I have done though is just very lightly rounded off the edges here. You probably can't quite see it on this. That's just to keep it from being sharp there. But I figured with this thing, I'm not trying to set any altitude records with it. And I really, really despise having to sand fiberglass. So I'm just giving it the minimum treatment there to keep it safe, and we'll go with that. Okay, everything's pretty much built at this point. I'm just waiting for the epoxy to go through its final curing here before we paint it. And I'm not going to worry about showing the painting on here, as painting's tedious and often much more time consuming than you want to watch here. If you want some pointers on spray painting rockets, there's a really good video on the R.E.A.R Rockets website. I highly recommend it. And I hope you had fun and a little less trouble building this than I did, and have a good flight.